grey sky over Zagreb reflected Ante Kovačic's mood on that cold winter morning. At just 17, the young midfielder carried not only a worn backpack on his shoulders, but also the weight of expectations from an entire family who had sacrificed everything so he could train at Dinamo Zagreb's academy. His eyes, two restless blue spheres, concealed the insecurity of someone who came from Slavonskog Broda, a small city in eastern Croatia where football was more a distant dream than a real possibility. The club's training fields glistened under a thin layer of morning dew, contrasting with the faded Soviet-era buildings surrounding the sports complex. Ante took a deep breath as he passed through the gates, feeling his stomach churn with a mixture of anxiety and admiration. This wasn't an ordinary training day. Luku Modrić, the national legend, had returned to Croatia during a break in the European season and would participate in the activities as part of a mentoring program for young talents. Upon entering the locker room, Ante noticed the curious glances from other young players, some of whom came from influential Zagreb families or had studied at private schools. His regional accent and worn-out cleats marked him as an outsider, someone who didn't belong in this world of privilege. The feeling of inadequacy grew with each step, fueled by whispered comments and muffled laughter behind his back. Coach Branimir Perić, a rigid man in his early 50s with emotional scars from the Independence War, had warned the young men about the importance of this special training session. For Ante, however, this opportunity represented something greater, a chance to prove his worth, to show that talent recognizes no social or economic boundaries. In his chest, next to the Dinamo crest, beat a heart determined to challenge any obstacle. When the players finally took to the field, a reverent silence fell over the environment as they spotted Luku Modrić. There he was, at 39 years old, hair slightly graying at the temples, but with the same serene and determined look that had inspired an entire generation of Croatians. Ante felt his legs tremble slightly, divided between admiration for his idol and growing anger at feeling invisible in this elitist environment. The morning's first exercises consisted of simple dribbles and short passes, an opportunity for Modrić to observe the technical level of the young talents. Ante executed each movement with mechanical precision, but his mind was distant, recalling the nights his father, a factory worker, had worked extra shifts to buy his first quality cleats. The pressure to justify those sacrifices weighed on his shoulders like an invisible cape of responsibility. Beside him, Mateo Begic, son of a well-known Zagreb businessman, proudly displayed his custom cleats and immaculate training uniform. With a constant group of admirers around him, Mateo represented everything Ante despised in the football environment: privilege disguised as talent, arrogance masquerading as confidence. The superior looks Mateo cast in Ante's direction ignited a dangerous spark within him, a silent fire fueled by years of social rejection. Coach Branimir divided the young men into groups for a ball possession exercise, and as if fate wanted to test his limits, Ante was placed on the same team as Mateo. Luku Modrić alternately participated with the teams, offering technical advice and demonstrating his privileged vision of the game. When he approached Ante's group, the world star showed particular interest in the technique of the young man from Slavonskog Broda, discreetly praising his ball control in tight spaces. That brief moment of recognition was enough to awaken jealousy in Mateo, who began deliberately intercepting passes intended for Ante, ignoring the collective dynamic of the exercise. The tension grew with each minute, perceptible in the glances exchanged between the young men and in the dense energy that hung over the training field. Ante breathed deeply, trying to control the anger that threatened to explode at any moment. The breaking point came when Modrić, in a demonstration of a through pass, chose Ante as his partner. Before the young man could receive the ball, Mateo intercepted the pass with an unnecessarily aggressive tackle, bringing Ante down on the wet grass. Not satisfied with the foul, he leaned over his fallen teammate and whispered words laced with venom, insinuations about his humble origins, about how people like him should be content to watch football on television instead of dreaming of playing it professionally. The silence that followed the fall was deafening. The other young players observed the scene with a mixture of surprise and discomfort, while Coach Branimir advanced with a severe expression. Ante rose slowly, his uniform stained with mud and his eyes overflowing with contained fury. In his mind, it wasn't just Matteo who had brought him down, but an entire system that seemed to constantly push him down because of his origins. When everyone expected Ante to retaliate or start a heated discussion, the young man did something completely unexpected. With a flushed face and watery eyes, he simply sat down on the wet grass, motionless as a statue. His hands trembled slightly as he untied the laces, removing his cleats with an unsettling calmness. In absolute silence, he placed them neatly by his side and took a deep breath, looking toward the horizon beyond the field. It wasn't disrespect, but a contained and dignified manifestation of his inner revolt against injustice, inequality, the feeling that some people were born with the path paved, while others had to climb invisible mountains. An uncomfortable silence took over the field as Coach Branimir approached with a confused expression. That silent reaction was more disturbing than any expected explosion. The young player rose slowly, picked up his cleats with dignity, and began walking barefoot toward the locker room. In his eyes, tears of frustration mingled with the light rain that began to fall over Zagreb, creating a liquid curtain that blurred his vision and distorted the faces of those watching him with a mixture of disapproval and secret respect for his restraint. While walking toward the locker room, Ante felt the weight of potentially having destroyed his own future. His bare feet sank into the mud like anchors, pulling him to the bottom of an ocean of instant regret. That impulsive gesture had been the culmination of years of frustration, but the price seemed too high. Expulsion from the academy would mean the end of the dream, not just for him, but for his entire family in Slavonski Brod. To his surprise, before he could reach the exit of the field, he noticed a brief exchange of glances between Modrić and Coach Branimir. The Croatian star discreetly approached the trainer and asked, with respect for the hierarchy, for a few minutes to talk with the young man before any disciplinary decision. Sometimes, we need to look beyond behavior to understand its cause. Modrić suggested with the serenity of someone who had experienced similar situations. The coach, still visibly upset but respecting the national idol's experience, agreed with a brief nod, giving Modrić permission to follow Ante to the locker room while he continued training with the other players. The empty locker room amplified every sound, the constant dripping of a poorly closed shower, Ante's heavy breathing as he gathered his belongings, and Luku Modric's soft steps entering the space. The young man kept his eyes fixed on his worn backpack, too ashamed to face the idol he had publicly disrespected. The silence between them seemed like a living entity, filling every inch of the space with palpable tension. Modrić sat on the wooden bench beside Ante, unhurried and without ceremony, like an old friend sharing an intimate moment. In his hands, an old and faded photograph showed a skinny boy with large eyes, wearing an improvised Dinamo Zagreb shirt, in front of a building partially destroyed by bombings. Without saying a word, the world star extended the photograph to the young man, who received it with trembling hands, confused about the meaning of that gesture. As Ante observed the image, Modrić began to narrate his own story, not the polished version circulating in the media, but the raw truth about growing up as a refugee during the war, herding goats to help his family, sleeping in abandoned hotels, and training football in parking lots marked by bomb craters. He spoke with the tranquility of someone who had transformed suffering into fuel, without romanticizing it, merely acknowledging its role in forging his character. Ante's face gradually transformed as Modrić shared episodes of prejudice he had faced in his first clubs, situations where his regional accent and humble origins had been mocked. The story of the peasant who would never be good enough echoed deeply in the young man, creating an invisible connection between two generations separated by fame and achievements, but united by the shared experience of being eternal outsiders in a world that privileged origins and connections. When Modrić finally mentioned the incident on the field, there was no condemnation in his voice, just a simple question that penetrated the armor of anger Ante had built around himself. Whether he would allow people like Matteo to define who he was, or if he would use that challenge as proof that he belonged in that world as much as anyone else. Perhaps what Croatian football needs, Modrić reflected with a distant look, is not another player with refined technique, but someone capable of starting from the foundations, of showing a new path for those who will come after. The idea of a new beginning hung in the humid air of the locker room, demanding not a verbal response, but a life decision that transcended that moment. The afternoon advanced slowly over the training fields when Ante and Modrić returned together, provoking surprised looks from the other players who had assumed the young man had been permanently expelled. Coach Branimir approached with a severe expression, ready to reaffirm his authority. But a silent look from Modrić was enough to communicate that the situation had been resolved in another way, one that didn't involve traditional punishments or public humiliations. The exercises resumed with a different energy, as if the morning's emotional storm had cleared the air, creating space for something new. Modrić suggested an unscheduled activity, a reduced game where mixed teams of young talents and more experienced academy players would compete on equal terms. The proposal, seemingly simple, carried a powerful message about true meritocracy and respect earned through ability, not privilege. To Mateo's visible embarrassment, Modrić chose Ante as captain of one of the teams, while he would lead the opposing team himself. The selection of subsequent players was based purely on technical observations made by the star during the morning, completely ignoring the unofficial social hierarchies that usually determined the dynamics among the young players. Some of Mateo's closest friends ended up on Ante's team, forced to recognize his talent or risk, openly contradicting Luka Modrić. The game began tense, with Mateo determined to prove that Modric's preference for the young man from Slavonskog Broda had been a mistake. His passes were excessively elaborate, his finishes forced, each movement a desperate attempt to draw attention to himself. Ante, on the other hand, seemed transformed. The conversation in the locker room had unlocked something within him, a calmness that allowed his natural talent to flow without the weight of anger or resentment. Midway through the first half, Ante executed a series of dribbles that left 3 opponents behind, including Modrić himself, who smiled with genuine admiration at being outplayed by the young man. The pass that followed, precise, measured, and altruistic, allowed a teammate to score easily. What made that moment special wasn't just the technical quality of the play, but the fact that the benefited teammate had been one of Mateo's closest friends, a gesture that demonstrated maturity and team vision above personal vendettas. From the sideline, Mateo observed the scene with an expression that betrayed his internal conflict. For a brief moment, his eyes reflected not just the usual envy, but something more complex. A flash of admiration quickly suppressed, an involuntary recognition of the talent he had tried to belittle. When his friends celebrated the goal, Mateo remained apart, pretending to adjust his shin guards while actually struggling with uncomfortable thoughts about privilege and merit. His fingers nervously pressed the dynamo crest on his uniform, as if questioning, perhaps for the first time, what it really meant to represent those colors. The following days transformed the Dinamo Zagreb training center into an unexpected social laboratory. Modric's continued presence, having extended his visit originally scheduled for just 1 day, created an environment where merit gradually overcame privilege. The star conducted special sessions after regular training and, to general surprise, personally invited Ante for technical demonstrations, treating him not as an apprentice, but as a collaborator. This dynamic didn't go unnoticed by the other young players, who began to orbit around Ante with genuine interest, curious about his tactical ideas and technical approaches. The same boy who weeks before ate lunch alone now found himself at the center of animated discussions about game systems and strategies, his voice gaining strength and confidence each day. Even some of Mateo's former allies naturally gravitated to this new social configuration, recognizing in the young man from Slavonskog Broda a natural leader, not by imposition, but by authentic respect. Mateo observed this transformation with a mixture of anger and confusion, unable to understand how his privileged position had been so quickly eroded. That night, in his spacious apartment in downtown Zagreb, he hid from his father's messages constantly asking about his performances and proximity to Modrić. an essential connection for the future, as he always emphasized in tense phone calls. The family pressure to be exceptional and make the right connections weighed on his shoulders more than anyone at the academy could imagine. In an act of desperation, he tried to approach Modrić after training, offering him a rare book about Croatian football history, a collector's piece his father had bought especially for the occasion. The star thanked him kindly for the gesture, but explained he had already arranged to visit Ante's family in Slavonski Brod that weekend, a response that not only postponed the implicit invitation, but clearly established where his priorities lay. The visit to the small city in eastern Croatia transformed into an almost mythical event among the young academy players. Modrić, accompanied only by Ante, politely declined the official car and driver offered by the club. "I want to see the real Croatia, not the tourist version," he explained simply to the sports director, who insisted, concerned about security and protocol issues. The star was firm. It would be a discreet visit without cameras or social media, just two players sharing a train journey like any ordinary citizen. In the simple streets of Slavonski Brod, the captain of the Croatian national team met the Kovačić family, the factory worker father, the nurse mother, and two younger brothers who looked at Ante with unwavering admiration, long before any external recognition. The absence of formalities or pretensions created an environment where Modrić seemed genuinely at ease, more relaxed than at official club events. The dinner at the modest Kovačić home, with traditional dishes proudly prepared by Ante's mother, became a silent lesson in values. Modrić listened attentively to stories of how the entire family took turns at extra jobs to keep Ante in the academy, of the collective sacrifice in the name of a shared dream. In that simple living room, decorated with newspaper clippings about the Croatian national team and children's medals from local tournaments, the concept of success gained a completely different dimension. It wasn't about individual fame, but about collective elevation. During dessert, while enjoying a traditional sweet from the region, Modrić shared an embryonic idea with the Kovačić family, a program that could identify and support young talents from rural and less privileged areas, offering them not just technical training but also educational and psychological support. Perhaps something like a new beginning for Croatian football, he reflected quietly. Novi Početak. Ante's father's eyes shone upon hearing those words, recognizing that his son's journey could open paths for hundreds of other young people with similar stories. The return to Zagreb marked the beginning of a new phase at the Dinamo Academy. The seed planted during the visit to Slavonski Brod, that Novi Početak mentioned almost as a distant dream, began to take concrete form. Inspired by the conversations with the Kovačić family and the reality he had witnessed in the small city, Modrić formally proposed to the club's board the creation of a program to identify and develop talents in rural and economically disadvantaged areas of Croatia. The project, initially received with skepticism by administrators concerned about costs, gained strength when the star announced he would personally finance the pilot phase and serve as a volunteer ambassador. The new initiative, officially named Novi Početak, quickly captured the imagination of the national sports media. Journalists who previously completely ignored Ante's existence now presented him as a symbol of a new approach to talent development in the country. The young man, still uncomfortable with the spotlight, insisted on directing attention to the program's greater message, the democratization of access to high-level football in a country still marked by profound regional inequalities. Matteo, observing the unfolding of these events from a distance, faced his own journey of self-discovery. The initial resentment had gradually given way to uncomfortable self-reflection. On a rainy afternoon, he approached Ante during a training break and, with visible difficulty, offered an apology for his previous behavior. The conversation that followed, brief and uncomfortable, didn't result in immediate friendship, but opened space for mutual respect that seemed impossible just a few weeks earlier. The most significant transformation, however, was happening behind the scenes at the club. Inspired by Modric's example, other established players began to show interest in participating in the Novi Početak program, offering to visit remote regions in search of young talents who would otherwise remain invisible to the system. What had begun as an isolated incident of disrespect was gradually transforming into a movement capable of reshaping the future of Croatian football. 6 months after the incident on the training field, Ante was called up to Croatia's under-19 national team, a remarkable achievement for a player who hadn't even made his professional debut. In the previous months, he had consistently stood out in the academy's technical reports, leading statistics in decisive passes and ball recoveries. In 3 consecutive tournaments, his technical evolution and tactical maturity had been meticulously documented by observers from the Croatian Federation, who initially came to watch other more hyped players but left impressed with the midfielder from Slavonskog Broda. The news of the call-up came through a personal call from Modrić, who had silently followed his progress and merely endorsed what the technical reports already indicated. As he hung up the phone, Ante contemplated the small apartment he shared with 3 other young academy players, reflecting on how a moment of loss of control had almost destroyed his dream, but ended up becoming the catalyst for something much greater than himself. The Maksimir Stadium, home of Dinamo Zagreb, was unusually full for a youth category game. In the stands, families from all parts of Croatia mingled, many of them visiting the capital for the first time, attracted by the promise of seeing their sons, nephews and neighbors participating in the first national tournament of the Novi Početak program. Among them, Ante's parents watched with tearful eyes as their son wore the captain's armband of the under-19 team, a symbol of leadership earned not by imposition, but by unanimous choice of his teammates. In the presidential box, Luku Modrića watched the match alongside Croatian Federation officials and UEFA representatives, who had shown interest in adapting the program's model for other countries with similar socio-economic challenges. The project that was born from a moment of conflict was now being studied as an example of social responsibility in sports, proving that football could be a genuine vehicle for transformation when its structures were rethought based on values, such as inclusion and equal opportunity. During the halftime break, Modrić went down to the locker room for a brief conversation with the young players. Upon entering the environment, he noticed something that made him smile discreetly. Ante and Matteo, previously antagonists, now animatedly discussed tactical strategies for the second half, with the mutual respect of those who had learned valuable lessons through conflict and reconciliation. The rivalry remained, but transformed into a positive fuel that elevated the performance of both and, consequently, of the entire team. Modric's speech was brief and direct, focused not on past glories, but on present responsibilities. He spoke about how each young man there represented not just himself, but entire communities that now saw themselves reflected in elite football. About how a player's true legacy isn't measured just in trophies, but in doors opened for those who would come after. The words, pronounced with the authority of someone who had lived every aspect of that journey, from exclusion to worldwide recognition, resonated deeply with the young athletes. When the match ended with a convincing victory for Ante's team, it wasn't the goals or spectacular plays that dominated the sports headlines the next day, but the image captured by an amateur photographer. In the stands, Luku Modrića, the refugee boy who became a world icon, emotionally embracing Ante's parents as they watched their son in the celebration on the field. That photograph, quickly going viral on social media, became the symbol not just of a talent development program, but of a universal truth that transcended sports: the transformative power of genuine recognition, active empathy, and the courage to transform conflicts into opportunities for collective growth. Ako volite ovakve priče, lajkajte I pretplatite se na naš kanal.